Good morning and welcome to the 21st meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2019. Can I please ask everyone in the public gallery to switch off your devices or turn them to silent? Thank you. Item 1 is decision on taking business in private. Do members agree to take items 4, 5, 6 in private this morning? Yes, thank you. Item 2 is the Section 23 report on Scottish Public Pensions Agency, update on management of the PS project. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning: Penelope Cooper, Chief Executive, Helen Mackenzie, Chair of the Audit and Risk Committee, and they're both from the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, Leslie Fraser, Interim Director General for Organisational Development and Operations, Gordon Wales, Chief Financial Officer, and Colin Cook, Director of Digital, and all three from the Scottish Government. I believe that Penelope Cooper would like to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, I would. Good morning and thank you for your time today. As Chief Executive of the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, I welcome Audit Scotland's Section 23 report and the 4 key messages within. The report focuses on a period of transformational change in the agency between 2013 and 2017, of which the implementation of a pension software platform was a major component. I joined the agency as Chief Executive in July 2017, and a key priority was to fully understand the pension software project, status and direction. I recognised an immediate need to implement thorough project governance reviews that would better support our supplier. In February 2018, I made the decision to end the contract with our supplier following the Office of the Chief Information Officer's January 2018 Technical Assurance Report that rated the project as red. Within 2 weeks of the report being delivered, I convened extraordinary meetings of the Audit and Risk Committee and the Management Advisory Board to share the report findings and brief Scottish ministers on the decision taken to close the project. Our focus was then, and is now, on putting the customers first. I'd like to reiterate there has been and remains no risk to the pensions paid by the Scottish Public Pensions Agency, which continue to be paid on time and in full. Regarding the report, I recognise there are key recommendations that the agency and wider Scottish Government need to take forward. The first key message on our business case and procurement exercise. A number of measures have been implemented to improve the agency's approach to improve capability throughout. In particular, a new structure has been defined for the digital transformation and IT operations, project management and procurement. This will ensure that our portfolio of digital improvement initiatives have robust governance and are continually reviewed, tested and moved forward. The agency is also changing the procurement approach to one of open and complete dialogue with vendors in order to ensure the scope is feasible and achievable within the timescales. Regarding the second message on project governance and resources. The agency has implemented stronger governance across the current suite of in-flight technology projects, together with much closer and proactive engagement with Scottish Government technology and digital assurance. As part of the planned target operating model, the agency has and will continue to put in place effective and consistent project management capability to ensure governance is understood and applied in a well-planned and structured fashion. This will allow better scrutiny and challenge of our strategic suppliers. Regarding the third message on contract delivery and external reviews, we agree our supplier was not able to provide a working system and did not achieve any of the project milestones. Our new procurement processes and guidelines mean that if such a bid was received now, it would not be accepted. Regarding the fourth message on our failure to achieve value for money in this project, we have thoroughly reviewed our spending commitments since the closure of the project. We're investing in current and future capability to provide greater functionality, wider automation and a continuity of core services. Please also note that Capita paid £700,000 in compensation in November 2018 following the conclusion of the legal process, and the SPPA outlay under the contract was £681,000. The figures in the 2018 report are potentially estimates, and if the committee would like, I can provide a concise answer on our current spend and forecasts in writing. In conclusion, as part of the lessons learned from the project, and the required transformation of the agency to better meet customer needs, a new strategic plan was created to make clear the agency's strategic direction and ambitions for the years 2019 to 24. The principal focus of the strategic plan is to prevent any similar occurrences from happening again. And the successful implementation of this transformation will enable the agency to more effectively respond to changing customer requirements, increase efficiency, deliver best value for taxpayers, and position the agency to increase the number of members serviced. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms Cooper. That's very helpful for us to learn what lessons you've learned. But we need to look back and ask questions on the report. And I'm going to ask Colin Beattie to open questioning for the committee.
Thank you, Mayor. I would refer you to Exhibit 1 in the Auditor General's report, which details the change of leadership over the life of the project. What are the reasons behind these large number of changes in the Chief Executive and the responsible officer during the lifetime of this project? Because to me it seems to indicate a level of instability at a senior level which is bound to have impacted.
The report does indeed detail the changes in leadership, and there were changes during the lifetime of the project. The report is correct. There was no one particular reason why there was a change in leadership. Going forward, we are ensuring roles and responsibilities are very clear. I have in place a succession planning to ensure that there won't be gaps if that happens in the future, and we will allow better scrutiny of the project going forward.
But shouldn't someone, and I'd like to know who the someone is, have looked at this and seen there's all these changes at a senior level, it's going to lead to some sort of instability or lack of continuity in the management of this project? Maybe they're not a good idea. Is there no one has that wider overview?
The project, the changes in leadership were not forecast. They were events that needed to be reacted to, and they were reacted to as best they could. The responsibility for the agency as a chief executive, accountable officer, that is the person who's put in place, and those changes were made. I wasn't there, so I can't explain why that happened. I can only say that going forward, I will make very sure that doesn't happen under my watch. And it's my responsibility as Chief Executive to ensure that I have robust and clear succession planning. So I'm putting in place a management team that is capable, if anything were to happen to me in an unexpected way, as can happen, they can pick up and carry on to avoid this happening going forward.
Ms Cooper, can I just intervene briefly here? We need to scrutinise the report in front of us, and I appreciate that you've come into post perhaps after a lot of this, but the committee has a duty to scrutinise this, and you've had an opportunity to set out future plans, and that was very welcome. But I need you to answer to the best of your knowledge the detail that's included in this report, and if you don't have that knowledge, that's fair enough, but if we can do that, then that would be extremely helpful. Thank you. Colin Beattie.
I think if I recall correctly, there was a period where the Chief Executive was actually seconded to the Scottish Government for a period of, was it about 6 months, 7 months, something like that?
That is
correct. Did that seem a very good idea? Shouldn't the Chief Executive have put their hand up and said, you know, we're in the middle of this massive project, take me away? And I mean, presumably that Chief Executive had no oversight during the period that they were seconded.
My understanding is he remained accountable officer and he remained responsible for this project, attended all the project boards and attended all the meetings.
But must have been distracted. I mean, clearly you're telling me that you don't have that information.
I don't have that information, no.
Perhaps Scottish Government does have that information.
We don't have that information, but our understanding is the same as Penelope's in terms of the oversight that the Chief Executive maintained throughout. I think the key point is that absolutely we recognise that this is not good practice and it's not what we would do for a project that was underway now. And there's a number of different layers of assurance that I think would come into play, both from the agency and through the audit committee and the management board there, but also through the technology assurance framework, which is now mandatory for all public bodies doing this kind of project. So that would also look at, for example, the appropriate skills and oversight of a project like this.
Looking back seems to have become rather opaque. Who do we speak to get that retrospective oversight, to understand what happened at that time? Who do we have to speak to?
So Mr. Beattie, if I could add a bit more colour perhaps to the agenda. So I took temporary responsibility for oversight of the Scottish Public Pensions Agency from January 2017 and then permanently from July 2017. So before that decision had been taken to second the then Chief Executive. But it became clear in the early part of 2017 that the Chief Executive wanted to exit the organisation. And so I agreed that that was a sensible route forward, and I then put plans in place to recruit a permanent successor, and that resulted in Penelope being appointed as now the permanent Chief Executive.
And you were aware of the turnover of senior staff at that point?
I was, but that was an active decision by the individual to leave the organisation. And clearly, if the individual wants to leave the organisation, there's very little I can do about that. So all I could do was react to that and put a permanent successor in place. And I think we can write to you on the rationale for the individual, the Chief Executive, going off on that secondment, if that would please the committee.
It might be interesting, but I'm rather more concerned about the whole sequence of events here, and how it came about and how it impacted on the project. And there doesn't seem to be anybody at this table that can really answer that question.
I mean, it clearly had an impact, but it's also, I think, important to understand that the previous Chief Executive who left in April 2015, that was a retirement. So this wasn't a case of the government moving people around in order to suit its specific priorities. These were active decisions by the two previous Chief Executives to leave the organisation.
Well, let's leave that just now. There's questions around the quality of the reporting on the project to the project board, Audit and Risk Committee, Management Advisory Board. It's not clear the extent to which adequate reporting was given, and there seems to be some indication that it was perhaps poor.
That is certainly, if I can answer that question, that is certainly the finding of the report. And we don't work in that way now. We now have a much deeper, in-depth reporting that includes full financials. We report to the MAB, the ARC. We have meetings of the senior leadership team. We have a project board that is comprised of a wide range of individuals, which includes a non-exec external critical friend, to ensure that we have that robustness. So the level of reporting subsequent to this, building on the lessons learned, that changed on my arrival. In fact, that was something that changed when I arrived. So
it's good to have the reassurance going forward, but being an audit committee, we tend to look back at what happened then and to try and find out why the reporting was not up to standard, why somebody wasn't jumping up and down and saying that we're not getting adequate information on this project. And for SPPA, it's a major project.
I'm very sorry, Mr. Beattie, I'm not in a position to answer that.
Can I ask the question again? Who do we have to speak to get that information?
Who in the Scottish Government is responsible for SPPA?
So I took, as I said earlier, I took on temporary responsibility for line management of the Chief Executive of the SPPA in January 2017, and then permanently from July 2017. At the same point at which Penelope Cooper was permanently appointed.
Who was responsible in the Scottish Government before that time?
So the line management of the Chief Executive previously lay with Alison Stafford, who's the now the Director General Scottish Exchequer. But the oversight, as far as the SPPA is concerned, was through a Fraser figure. Two individuals carried out that role during the period in question, and both those individuals have left the government.
High turnover all round. it seems. Colin, did you want to ask any
It
further?
certainly makes it very difficult for us to get the information that we need as an audit committee.
Yes.
And the questioning so far really hasn't elicited the sort of responses that I would have hoped for. So frankly, I don't see any point in continuing my questions.
Okay, thank you. Bill Bowman.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I was going to ask about the Fraser figure, because I know the Auditor General mentions in point 4 that the Management Advisory Board is composed of the Accountable Officer, non-executive members and the Fraser figure sponsor from the Scottish Government, and that you also have an Audit and Risk Committee. So I think you've maybe answered the Fraser figure part. Coming to the Audit and Risk Committee, before I try and look backwards, I went to your website to try and find out a little bit more about it, and I didn't really have much success in the sense that there was no explanation there, I don't think, unless we missed it, of the Audit Committee, its members, who they are, or its minutes. We then looked at the Management Advisory Board, which has a small section on the Audit and Risk Committee and refers to minutes, but doesn't actually attach them. And the Management Advisory Board's minutes are only there for the past year. Thereafter, we have to email to ask for them, which I did. So I wonder if you could explain a little bit about what is the Audit Committee and what is it doing, because I couldn't find that out from your website.
I can answer that one. So the Audit and Risk Committee comprises myself and 2 non-executive members, and those members are from the financial services industry and also from the governance background, and myself from finance and procurement. So we've got a good mix there for the challenges we're looking at just now. Our agendas will cover risk, so we're looking at the risk register, we're looking at key risks of the organisation, a heat map. We do a deep dive every meeting, looking at one particular risk and getting the lead person within the SPPA to come and bring that risk to life so we can see that that's actively being managed. We also receive the reports from internal and external audit, and at our meeting on Monday we looked at this report in detail and started to think about what do we need in terms of risk management KPIs going forward to make sure that the recommendations are being followed throughout the process. So that's an overview of what we do.
So I think there's a transparency issue that's not covered by your website,
Okay.
Explaining that. Well, you know why you've come here. Looking back, have you looked back to see what the Audit Committee was doing when all of this was going on? Because it doesn't seem to have been putting its hand up or raising red flags.
Yes, and I think that that's something that we certainly look to address on that. And it's a difficult balance in governance, isn't it, between receiving reports from the people that are coming to you and then trying to dig underneath that to see if that's actually what's going on. And I think that that's something that we're certainly very aware of currently in terms of how do we get under those figures. And
but I don't think the Auditor General, unless I again missed that, said that the Audit Committee had been active in saying there were issues here.
I think you're right there, yes. I think that actually when the Chief Executive came in, the current one, that was where the full stop was drawn under it. And I think that colleagues on the Audit and Risk Committee possibly needed to have other mechanisms to try to raise concerns.
So without going into names of specific individuals, is it a new Audit Committee or the same people on it that were there during this?
There's one person who was there at the latter end of this period, but it is a new Audit Committee predominantly, yes.
So we probably have the same sort of issue that we have.
I would say so.
The thing that confuses me about this, though, Penelope Cooper, is the report in front of us was published in June 2019 by the Auditor General.
Yep.
So the Auditor General and her team must have spoken to people in your agency to elicit the information in front of
Correct.
us. So who are the people that she spoke to?
I don't know the full list, I'm sorry, but I do know that they spoke with the chair of the outgoing chair of the audit ARC and the ARC and the outgoing chair of the MAB. Both of those were provided information for the report.
Sorry, the ARC and the MAP.
Sorry,
just
I
for
beg
the
your pardon.
public.
The Audit and Risk Committee,
yes.
Outgoing chair, and the Management Advisory Board, outgoing chair, both provided information for the audit.
Okay, so those people provided information for the
Yes.
audit after they had left the organisation?
No, they were still incumbent at the time.
But they've gone now?
They have gone now. They finished in February of this year.
Okay, but she must have spoken to, Audit Scotland must have spoken to more than 2 people. There must be more people in your organisation have knowledge of what has gone on here.
Indeed, they spoke to many people. With regard to the non-executives, those are the 2 that I know that they spoke to from non-executive point of view. I don't have the full list of everybody they interviewed. Audit Scotland spent quite some time in the organisation reviewing past papers, minutes. They spoke with myself, the procurement person that we have. They spoke with the previous chief executive. But I'm afraid I don't have the full list. Audit Scotland would be able to tell you that, I expect.
Okay, this is not very satisfactory, but Bill, do you want to continue? Yes.
Comment in the sense that I know whenever there's a change of management, new management always wants to look forward, not necessarily back. But I mean, are you satisfied that from an audit committee perspective, you know the lessons that need to be learned and what you should be doing now?
Certainly satisfied we know the lessons, and I think that we're chunking what we're going to do in the future into 3 phases. So at the moment we're in the phase of the business case for the new system. So we've got some risk KPIs around timescales, about looking at when we reach checkpoints and making sure that those are reached and trying to flag things up as soon as we can. I think I'm very clear from my experience. I was on an NHS board where there were some financial issues where we needed to flag those and raise those at a very senior level, even to the minister. So I'm very clear of what happens through a governance process if things seem to be going wrong and the channels, i.e. the chief executive, and the response thereof isn't successful. So I think I've got the experience to raise it up the tree if that needs to be. But our focus is on early intervention. So we're looking at KPIs that tell us early if things are starting to go wrong. So that amber red or the amber green designation in the audit report, that would start to ring bells for us immediately, and we would be talking to Penelope about that. So I think that's, in terms of, again, looking forward, experience of knowing and being confident to keep raising and raising and raising, and also that early warning system.
Okay, thank you.
Willie Coffey.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning to you. I wonder if I could ask some questions around the software procurement of the project, and to try your best to explain to the committee what happened here. For us as an audit committee, we've seen examples of this on many occasions, and it's a mystery to us why nobody else seems to be able to see these things going wrong. If you look at the Auditor General's report, you see some of the classic failures that lead to software design failure: poor specification initially, poor procurement, lack of skills, lack of estimation of time taken to deliver these projects, lack of embracing accepted development methodology standards that are in place. So these all happened then. Firstly, Mrs Cooper, can you explain why they happened? Was there a lack or dearth of experience within the organisation to carry this project through? And then I'll come on to try to ask you why you think you now have the skills in place to deliver this successfully if you're doing it next time round.
I will do it. I think there are several factors behind it. I think firstly, the agency didn't have a clear strategic direction, so it was procuring without real clarity, and the report is very clear. It wasn't clear about what it was procuring. That was the first thing. It was procuring under the old regime and regulations, so a business case wasn't required, a procurement notice was required, and that is something that has changed. So we will produce a robust business case. We already have for the one we have currently. The skills and ability within the agency, this is, for those people, this was the first time they'd ever done it, and they didn't have the knowledge and experience to do that. And that was a risk, and this is a contributing factor, undoubtedly. We now work much more closely in collaboration with the procurement, the central procurement. We're working very, very closely with digital so that we have that skill and capability on tap. We reorganised the agency, so there was no clear, experienced head of IT. I am recruiting a head of IT. In fact, I'm interviewing tomorrow. So that was missing. So the competence within the organisation, as the audit report clearly identifies, was missing, and we are replacing that. The regime under which we procured has changed, so we now produce a robust business case, not a procurement notice. And we have absolute clarity about what the strategy for the agency is, where we're going and what we need to support that. And we will work in a different way with the procurement, with the suppliers. We're doing a strategic architecture review, so we really know what we need and what kind of procurement we need to have. We don't have the same time pressure. One of the factors that the report mentions is they were procuring against the clock. And I've changed the kind of software license that we have with the provider, so we don't have that ticking clock. We have a little bit more leeway to really get this right this time.
Billy Coffey.
I mean, some of that's encouraging. That this time round we'll see more effective IT skills deployed in the project to deliver this. But could I just remind you what it does say in the Auditor General's report, that development methodologies were in place in the organisation, Prince 2 it's called.
Yes.
It allows you to develop software in a consistently recognised, controlled manner, but it just didn't seem to be adopted or understood. Can you shed any light on that? And can you give us an assurance that that's not going to happen this time round?
Yeah, Prince 2 skills were in place in as much as people had done the training. And I think there's a world of difference between having done some training and having experience. So we will have people who have done the training and have the experience, because when you do something for the first time, you're learning, and these people were learning, and we're bringing in experienced resource that knows what it's doing because it's already done it before successfully.
As convener, is there is a role here for the Scottish Government officials and colleagues, I think, to answer it. It says in the Auditor General's report here that you informed, the organisation informed the government that it didn't have the skills to further probe the tender at that stage, but the organisation took no further action. So I'm interested in exploring what on earth happened there, and why was there no liaison, exchange, assistance to intervene at an early stage before the project just rumbled on and made, the software started failing, and then 2 years later we decided to cancel it. Why aren't we intervening at an earlier stage to try to address these issues that arise? And I think the Scottish Government officials have got to address that too, I would ask, just now.
The reports or the assessment and audit we carried out, or the Office of the Chief Information Officer, as was at that time, did indeed raise those questions about skills, and they make a series of recommendations which are up to the organisation and the agency to respond to. We then went back at a later stage and looked at the degree to which those recommendations had been dealt with, and that actually was one of the key reasons we moved the assessment into a red, and ultimately the decision was taken to stop the process, that the recommendations that were made for management action throughout the assessment process were not being taken. Excuse me.
Could I refer you to page 16 of the Auditor General's report, please? It says, that chart there says that we started identifying errors in the software in May 16. It was a further 2 years beyond that before the closure announcement was made. I mean, 2 years, for goodness sake. Why did it take so long to come to that conclusion? But the point I'm making is there should have been a heck of a lot more work done prior to the software beginning to fail to specify this thing properly and adequately. Why didn't we have the skills within the team to do that? I mean, it's a question for both. I mean, the Scottish Government have oversight of this, so they must have seen this project was failing during those 2 years, and it took so long to.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, clearly, the Audit Scotland have made that point very powerfully, and I know that Penelope accepts it, and we accept it. The assessment process identified that weakness as well, and clear recommendations were made. The skills to help and support organisations such as SPPA are available through the Digital Directorate, the Digital Transformation Service, and the Commercial Service that I run. It remains the responsibility of the individual chief executive of an agency to engage with us and to purchase those services. They are free to find other mechanisms to do so, whether that's going directly to the private sector or employing people themselves. In those instances, we offer support, and we are currently engaged going forward to do both of those things, assist both in the procurement of private sector skills and in the recruitment of the individuals to work in the agency. So I think that those lessons have clearly been learned. But from an audit and assessment point of view, which is an independent process, the issues were identified, the skills were available, they were just not taken up. And I think ultimately that is what led to the correct decision that Penelope took on the basis of our advice to stop the project. Yes, we could perhaps have done that earlier, and I think that's one of the lessons that we've learned.
Okay, I know other colleagues want to follow up on these issues. Convener, thank you.
Let me follow up on that. Colin, you're putting the responsibility for procuring your services, if you like, asking for the Scottish Government for help at the door of the Chief Executive. But I'm still confused about this leadership issue, because on page 10 of the Auditor General's report, there's a timeline about leadership. And we discover that the previous Chief Executive of the Pensions Agency was in post for 13 years. Now, that seems to me a sensible amount of time for such a critical agency for our public sector workers. Then the government appoints a new Chief Executive in July 2015, but only a year later then seconds them to the Scottish Government. Now, why on earth would government pull in a Chief Executive of one of its critical agencies into government after just a year in post? That seems to me a key issue here, because then you've got acting, and then so-and-so left, and then there was another appointment. Gordon Wales, why on earth would the Scottish Government pull in the Chief Executive after a year in post?
I think we need to write to you on that specific issue.
Why can't you tell me now?
Because I'm not aware of the personal circumstances surrounding the previous Chief Executive and his role, and how that decision was actually taken.
But it's not personal. If it was personal circumstances, they might be off ill. The Scottish Government, clearly this person was working, and the Scottish Government decided that their skills were better used within government rather than in the Pensions Agency.
But as Penelope Cooper has said, the Chief Executive remained in an oversight role, so we're still actively the Chief Executive and the accountable officer for the organisation at the time.
Oh, so they were doing two jobs?
There remained that oversight role.
Well, clear. That seems to me. So you were expecting them to oversee the Pensions Agency and do an additional job at the Scottish Government. It clearly didn't work, because it ended up in this mess.
It's clearly a contributing factor, but the exact circumstances I wouldn't be able to comment on.
And is that a good enough answer for this committee when we're looking at this report with such dire consequences?
No, I accept it would be helpful for you to have additional information, and we'd be very happy to write to you to set out those circumstances.
Because I'm not actually interested in the personal circumstances here of the individual. I'm interested in the strategic decision of government to have appointed a Chief Executive to a key agency and then decide to pull them into another job, or effectively give them two jobs. I mean, that was clearly the Scottish Government's decision, because it was a secondment to the Scottish Government.
I accept that.
And the Scottish Government is also responsible for making sure this agency works properly. So why take away its leader?
I accept that. And as
Leslie
I said,
Fraser, do you...
I think we would need to write to you with additional circumstances.
That Chief Executive subsequently left the Scottish Government, and neither Gordon nor I know the circumstances surrounding that individual's career decisions. So we happily look into that and report back to the committee on that, but we don't have that information just now.
Okay, thank you. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd like to stick on this area for me. First of all, if I can ask the SPPA, why did the SPPA decide to award the contract to Capita, given that the advice from the legal department in the Scottish Government was ask more questions? This is abnormally low. Have another look at this. Why did the SPPA go ahead anyway?
I'm basing my answer on the basic same information that Audit Scotland had in terms of minutes and notes. The reassurance that the agency obtained from Capita was that because the agency did challenge, it did go back and ask Capita questions. It did ask, are you sure this is the price that you mean? And the answer came back that yes, that Capita were content that they could provide this. It allowed their margin. Their intention was to use this as something of a loss leader in order to gain a hold in the Scottish pensions market. That answer satisfied the agency. They didn't have the skills to prepare the additional questions that they would have had to have gone back to Capita, and they didn't have the time because they had time pressure. So under the procurement guidelines that pertained at the time, they had to go with the cheapest. That was the driver. Capita were the cheapest. They were second on quality, and they went with that bid. As I said in my statement, that bid would not go ahead now. We would not accept that bid, but under the circumstances at the time, they did.
And thank you for that answer, because I want to look at the Scottish Government's role in this, because there's an award of a contract and it is classed as abnormally low. SPPA come to the Scottish Government and say, here's what we've got, and Scottish Government legal say you need to go back and ask more questions. Now, crucially, the SPPA come back and say, we don't have the skill set to do this. We don't know the questions to ask. I'm paraphrasing, but that's how I understand it. The Scottish Government at that point appears to have said, crack on. Is that a fair analysis?
That's not how I would interpret it. The SPPA sought advice, and they were given advice, and then used that advice to go back and challenge, but with the benefit of hindsight, not to the level that clearly would have illustrated the issues that then subsequently came to be fatal flaws in this project.
Forgive me, Leslie Fraser,
yes.
because I think you've missed out a stage, if I might respectfully put
yes.
it that way, because they did come to the Scottish Government and legal did say go back and ask more questions, but the SPPA came back and said we do not have that skill set. Am I not correct?
I couldn't say the exact timing of when the SPPA recognised that they had not sufficient skills, whether that was with hindsight or at the time.
It was at the time, according to the Auditor General's report at paragraph 15. The SPPA informed the Scottish Government Legal Department that it did not have the skills to further probe the tender. SPPA took no further action, accepted the bid. The Scottish Government's dropped out after being told by the SPPA it doesn't have the skills to interrogate this,
yes.
hasn't it?
That's not the approach that would be taken now.
Accepted, but
yes.
it was the approach taken at the time.
It was the approach taken at the time because there were different standards that were being relied on at that point. There's now a mandatory process of technological assurance, which would go through all of these different elements and assure that the relevant steps had been taken for a project of this scale. And that's exactly the process that SPPA is undertaking with the appropriate colleagues in Scottish Government.
My concern at the time, you see, Penelope Cooper said in response to Willie Coffey that, and again I'm paraphrasing, but at the time there was a major dearth in skills within the SPPA to do a project like this, and they needed support, and they told the Scottish Government they needed support. Now this is the body that looks after the pensions of
Indeed.
the NHS, our education, our police, our fire, their pensions, and it is a body that is telling the Scottish Government we do not have the skills to do what we're about to do. The Scottish Government washes its hands on the basis of this report. It majorly took its eye off the ball and took a laissez-faire attitude to what the SPPA was telling it. Is that not a fair analysis, Leslie Fraser?
That's not the analysis that I would put on this. I think there were very different standards that were underpinning this process at the time. The critical thing is that pensions continued to be paid on time and in full. There was no threat to the public service. The question is about the way and the most effective way in which new technology could come in and improve the service to pensioners and to citizens in Scotland. And we, along with the SPPA, firmly believe that there are lessons to be learned. We agree with the key messages in the Audit Scotland report, and that has underpinned a change in the approach that we would take, which has been introduced from 2017. The standards and the approach that was taken in 2014-15 was different to that, and absolutely there are lessons to be learned from that.
Alex Neil.
Can I just go back to this issue about the change of Chief Executive? If you look at Exhibit 1 in the Auditor General's report, it makes it clear there were at least 6 Chief Executives, that includes interim and acting Chief Executives, over a 2-year period. 6 Chief Executives between April 2015 and in July 2017. So can I just ask some questions on this? The Chief Executive who left in April 2015 had been in post for 13 years, and yet when he left, an interim Chief Executive was appointed, and the new Chief Executive didn't start till July 2015. Surely if somebody was retiring, and everybody would presumably knew well in advance they were retiring and when, why was there a need to appoint an interim Chief Executive? Surely that should have been done in plenty of time. In fact, you would think you would have some kind of rollover period when they doubled up, maybe for a month or something. So why did that happen?
I can't explain why that happened. I can only agree with you entirely, Mr Neil, that in future that is exactly what would happen. We would have robust succession planning. So, for example...
Ms Cooper, sorry, to be fair, I think it's more a question for the Scottish Government. We appreciate you can't answer that. Can I have someone from the Scottish Government, please? Leslie Fraser.
I can't give you the particular circumstances that led to that arrangement, Mr Neil. It may have been that there were good skills within the next level down that meant that an interim arrangement was appropriate, but I don't have that specific information here.
Okay, well, let's go to the next one. So the interim Chief Executive served from April 2015 to July 2015 when a new Chief Executive was appointed. And that Chief Executive is the one who was seconded to the Scottish Government. Can I ask this sequence? Was he offered a secondment to the Scottish Government and then decided to leave the agency, or did he decide to leave the agency and then was seconded to the Scottish Government?
No, the decision to leave the Scottish Government was taken after the secondment.
No, to leave the agency. At the point, Gordon, when he was seconded, so did somebody from the Scottish Government say, we want you into the Scottish Government, and then he decided he was going into the Scottish Government and wanted to leave the agency, or was it the other way round?
So the decision to leave the agency by that individual was not particularly as a result of the circumstances related to the secondment. It was a decision to leave the agency and the Scottish Government in its entirety. So effectively to resign as the Chief Executive. In other words, did not want to go back and fulfil that post as the Chief Executive on a permanent basis, on a continuing basis.
But still the question is, what came first? The decision to second him or his indication that he wanted to leave the agency?
His indication to leave the agency was significantly after the point at which he was seconded. So that conversation took place with me in the early part of 2017.
So he was seconded to the government before he indicated he wanted to leave the agency?
Yes, that's my understanding.
So why was he seconded?
As I said earlier on, I don't understand the particular detailed circumstances.
What was he seconded to? What job?
The work that he was doing was looking at corporate shared services, financial shared services for the government.
So how, in terms of the secondment, how many hours a week was he to work in the secondment?
Sorry, I don't have that detail with me.
And how many hours a week was he allocated to oversee his job?
Again, I don't have that level of detail with me.
Was he getting 2 salaries?
No.
So he was getting 1 salary. So was he being paid by the government or paid by the agency?
As I understand it, he was still being paid by the agency.
How do you know details of the pay but nothing else?
That's my understanding, but I'd be perfectly happy to obtain those details and write to the committee. with the exact circumstances.
With all due respect, you should have come here this morning with the answers to these, because it's a fairly big issue in the report, and I think you need to do your homework better the next time you appear in front of a committee. They then got an acting chief executive, who I take it was full-time.
That's correct.
Was that an external appointment?
No, it was an internal appointment.
And was it advertised?
No. That person had been acting in a previous role and was effectively the de facto deputy chief executive, so was the right person to take on that role on a temporary basis.
But that person left, well, they left in February 2017, so they lasted from October 2016 to February 2017.
No, it was the same person. It was effectively just a change in title. There was continuity of that person through that period.
So the chief executive that was appointed in March 2017, was that another person? Was that somebody completely new?
So the person appointed as the permanent chief executive at that time was Penelope Cooper, but Penelope took up post in July.
So it was a change of personnel again?
Yes, and if we refer back...
Sorry, what happened to the guy who was the acting chief executive?
He returned to normal duties within the Scottish Public Pensions Agency.
Right.
And
I
subsequently...
take it the job was advertised for the next full-time permanent chief executive?
Yeah, so I took the decision that, given the circumstances surrounding the agency's project over the previous years, given the challenges that it faced, I felt it was really important to have an external appointment. So rather than carrying out an exercise in the civil service, the post was advertised both within the civil service and externally, because I wanted to make sure that we brought in the most appropriate skill set for the challenges ahead, and the most appropriate person through that exercise appointed was Penelope Cooper.
So just to be clear, the acting chief executive appointed in October 2016 was the same person as the interim chief executive appointed in April 2017?
That's my understanding, yes.
So why was this change of status? What is the change of status from acting to interim?
Well,
after they've been doing the job all that time.
Well, because of the circumstances surrounding the chief executive leaving. So the person had been in an acting role, but of course the previous chief executive was still the permanent chief executive. When he left, it was then appropriate to appoint that individual who was carrying out the role then as the interim chief executive rather than as acting. So the defining moment is the departure of the permanent chief executive.
Which was in February 2017?
Correct. And of course that individual took a decision to leave at a relatively short notice. So and of course there was then a period over which I then had to carry out the recruitment exercise and put someone in place. And because Penelope Cooper came from the financial services industry, there's quite a long lead time associated with departure.
So during the period when there was an acting chief executive and the previous chief executive who was still seconded to the Scottish Government with an oversight function, what was the division of responsibility between the acting chief executive and the chief executive who was doing two jobs?
Certainly my understanding from my reading of the arrangements at the time is that the acting chief executive was effectively taking day-to-day decisions, but the permanent chief executive still had an oversight role, and I think, as Penelope said earlier, still attended major committees and management boards and so on.
I mean, this is shambolic. It's utterly shambolic. I mean, if you did this in the private sector, you'd be sacked, and we allowed this to happen. And there's no explanation, I think, for any of this. I think we need an absolutely detailed account, and the whole thing, not just in relation to the secondment, but in relation to why somebody who's clearly retiring after 13 years, why is the job not advertised well in advance so that there's at least some transitional period, as you would normally surely expect in an agency of this kind, at least of a month or so, before the retiring chief executive actually retires. So right through this sorry saga explained in Exhibit 1, I think we need a very, very detailed account of timelines, descriptions, jobs, division of responsibilities, who in the civil service was responsible. Did this go to a minister to be approved? Who approved this, at each stage? Why did they approve it? we need chapter and verse, because I think we're all agreed, including yourself, that this was a major contributing factor to what ended up as a total shambles, which has done enormous damage to the reputation of the government, as well as the public service, the pensions agency, in terms of managing IT contracts.
On the back of that, can I ask about sponsorship? Because in all the audit reports we look at, government sponsorship is a key theme. So who was the sponsoring person or department in the Scottish Government for the SPPA?
So the sponsor arrangements are normally reserved for non-departmental public bodies. With agencies, it tends to be a Fraser figure relationship, because...
What does that mean, Mr Wales?
So a Fraser figure is it's a consequence of a report back in 1991 by, I think, Sir Angus Fraser, about the government having an individual, because of course an executive agency is part of the core Scottish Government, unlike a non-departmental public body, which is a more arm's length relationship, and there are formal sponsorship arrangements that are in place with a non-departmental public body. With an agency, because that proximity is much greater, then the relationship that's put in place is something called a Fraser figure.
So who was the Fraser figure?
So
throughout this period?
As I said earlier on, there was a difference between the line manager and the Fraser figure. The Fraser figure was previously, there were two individuals carrying that out, Alistair Brown and Eleanor Ryan, both of whom who have left the government. One of the things that I did when I took on temporary arrangements for the Scottish Public Pensions Agency in January of 2017 was I looked at the oversight arrangements that were in place, and when I took on permanent responsibility for the line management of the Chief Executive from July 2017, I decided it was appropriate that the line management and the Fraser figure roles should be the same. So from that point onwards, I have both been the line manager to and the Fraser figure for the agency. So there is no separation of those roles any longer. So I now hold the accountable officer as Penelope Cooper accountable for the delivery of the performance of the agency, and as the Fraser figure I am attending the management board and the audit and risk committee and so on. So I have a level of oversight which is different.
Alec Neil.
Just in supplying this information, can you also tell us how much of this went for ministerial approval? Because I would be disappointed if none of it was given ministerial approval. I would be disappointed at some of the decisions that were given approval, but I think we need to know at what level was all this at every stage signed off. And my final question is, the chief executive who eventually resigned, who was seconded and had the two jobs, did he get a severance package?
Mr Neil, sorry, can I stop you? Because this has been bugging me throughout. The assumption that all of these predecessors are men. You may be right, but it can't be accepted as an assumption.
The reason I'm saying that is because I think they were.
Well, you may be right, but I think it's worded as an assumption. Maybe Ms Cooper can briefly clarify that point.
Yes, the interim chief executive from April 2015 was in fact a woman.
Okay.
Oh, right,
sorry,
okay.
I'll allow you to continue.
Right, okay. He or she, the person who was seconded to the Scottish Government simultaneously while still retaining the role of chief executive, when that person eventually left the agency, were they given a severance package?
So it was a resignation. So there was no additional payments made over and above what someone would normally receive if they resign from an organisation.
And that was based on the terms and conditions of their job with the agency, not with the government?
Indeed, yes, absolutely were.
Okay.
And Sarva.
Can I just clarify something that you said there, Gordon, earlier on around how the individual was paid when they were chief executive and then seconded to the government? I think you said that they weren't paid for two different jobs. They were still being paid by the pensions agency rather than by the Scottish Government?
That's my understanding, but I'd be very happy to clarify that when I write to the committee with all the other details.
So, in effect, the Scottish Government had the pension agency paying for their chief executive but took the person away to do a job for them effectively for free?
That's one way of looking at it, yes.
Okay. So we took away some organisation's leader to do another job and didn't let them do their full-time leadership job in the pensions agency, is effectively what you're saying. Can I ask what they were seconded for?
As I said earlier on, my understanding was that the role was to perform an oversight and a study into shared services within the core Scottish Government.
So they weren't seconded to something that was uniquely to do with the operation of the Pensions Agency, even in terms of strategic long-term planning or whatever?
Well, there was a link, because financial shared services covers quite a significant breadth of the government's activities, everything from paying suppliers from a day-to-day basis for the goods and services that they provide to the kind of thing that the public Pensions Agency does, which is pay high-volume, customer-focused pension payments. So it ranges in everything in between. So there was a link directly with the Scottish
And I imagine
Pensions
the
Agency
Chief Executive of the Pensions Agency is a well-paid job.
So the Scottish Public Pensions Agency
Yep.
role sits at Deputy Director 1A as far as the civil service
And what is
grading is
that
concerned.
in terms of band, what is that?
So the broadband, I don't have the exact figures.
Roughly?
So roughly between something like 70 and £100,000. That's very rough, I have to say. But
So the SPPA was paying a Chief Executive £70,000 to £100,000 to not effectively do their job full time, so they could go and work for free for the Scottish Government.
as I said, that's one way that you could look at it. But there was certainly benefit from that individual bringing the experience that they had in previous roles to look at wider shared services arrangements within government.
And in terms of the, because Alec Neils and Jenny Mara have both covered the Chief Executive side, but in terms of the responsible officer side, there's obviously quite a high volume of change, particularly in the period 2016 to 2018. And there's obviously so the Senior Responsible Officer 3 was only there for about 3 months. And then that changed. The high turnover on the Senior Responsible Officer side is also a cause of concern. Do you want to say just a bit about why that happened?
I don't think I would be able to specifically comment on that. Perhaps Penelope has some information.
I can comment on the last one. She went off sick, so
Right.
she was the responsible officer when I arrived, and she went off sick in July.
And is there a connection between the changeover of the Senior Responsible Officers with the not smooth path, shall we put it, of the acting, interim and permanent Chief Executives? Is there a connection?
I don't think so.
Or were we
no.
just unlucky to be having a rocky road on both sides?
I'm not aware of a connection between them.
Okay, and I know Alec Neil has asked for some written communication about the ministerial oversight. Can you set that out for us, though, Gordon, just as a wee bit just now about, in this period, what was the level of engagement with ministers, and in particular in this high changeover period of mid-2016 to 2018, what was the level of oversight, discussion and interaction with Scottish ministers?
So I don't have the exact detail of every single interaction, but clearly ministers were being informed of the key events that were happening in the agency, and in particular when milestones were not being met. So ministers were being advised of that.
Were they just purely being advised for information, or were they actively part of the decision-making process?
So ministers were clearly given the opportunity to scrutinise further and to ask questions and so on. But of course, day-to-day decision-making rests with the Chief Executive of the organisation.
Thank you.
Do members have any further questions for the panel? Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to follow up on something Colin Cook said, just to make sure I understood it. As a result of a whole series of IT failures, structures have been put in place to provide support within the various bodies, so that they have a resource that they can come to and get help and assistance. SPPA didn't do that. Now, if I recall correctly, Colin Cook said that they had a choice. Does that mean that within government and the different bodies, they have a choice as to whether to make use of that capability or can go off and do their own thing? And does that make sense?
Be clear about this. They have no choice about the audit and assessment process. All projects, regardless of size, all digital and IT projects, have to be registered with the digital assurance team, and they will be subject to a check if they meet qualifying thresholds. And we've talked about this in the past for a major project. That's £5 million lifetime value. So that is a no-choice issue. When it comes to judgments about the skills that they require to run their agency, that is a matter for the Chief Executive. That can be done with the support of a shared service that I operate, the Digital Transformation Service, which provides people like technical architects, service designers, software engineers and the like, or it can be done directly with the market if they choose to go out for external support. And I have a function that can help them procure the right service at the right cost. Or they might decide that the issue is of sufficient importance that they wish to recruit a team internally. And again, I have a service that can help them identify people with the right skills to do that. But those latter two judgments are a matter of management judgment, and therefore they would rest with the Chief Executive or the appropriate person within the agency. And as I said, going forward, Penelope has done both of those. She's decided both to bring someone into the team with IT skills, and she's engaged us in finding that person, and she's procuring extra support from the marketplace, and she's engaged with us to support that process.
Does that not still leave a potential gap that if the Chief Executive of whichever function or area decides that they can do it themselves in-house, or they can go out to the market, they can still do that without having to refer to yourself?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Alex Neil.
Touching on that as well in terms of procurement, I mean, given the amount of money across the board the Scottish Government and its agencies, all its agencies now spend on IT, both capital and revenue spend, every year, and we are talking over, into billions every year. Why is it every agency goes out and does their own thing, reinvents the wheel? Why is there no bulk purchase, particularly of capital purchases? Why? It seems to me that in terms of value for money, this is really an antiquated way of procuring services. Am I right? Am I wrong?
I think we have recognised increasingly that there are better opportunities and better ways of coordinating procurement of IT services across the piece. For example, within the current spending review, we are ensuring that we have forward plans from every part of the Scottish Government so that we can make those judgments and make those recommendations to ministers if we believe there are the potential for duplication. So I would accept that there are improvements that we can be made if we change the way in which we procure IT services.
Let me just take the example of the National Health Service, Gordon. I mean, my health board, Lanarkshire, alone spends £30 million a year on IT services. Some of that's capital, some of it's revenue. And you multiply that across the health service probably spends not far short of £750 million or something of that order on IT services between capital and revenue. And yet every health board, there's 23 of them, and now every IGB is doing their own thing. It's absurd, and the waste of money must be enormous. When are you going to get a grip?
I mean, I do, and I know that colleagues in the health service take the same view and have undertaken a similar exercise to myself in terms of understanding what is being spent where and have the capability to support that. So I do know that that is something that they are addressing in the health service. There are also examples, and I think increasingly important examples where we are building common components and common platforms, which will mean that organisations don't have to procure because they have been done once on behalf of the entire Scottish public sector, or in some cases just the Scottish Government.
Voluntary? I mean, participation. Going by what your last reply to Colin, is it not time for a bit of dérégiste regime here? Because it is public money, and we're about to deal with the prison service, which claims its problems are because it's underfunded. Talk to the police service; they say they're underfunded. Education say they're underfunded. Everybody in their granny say they're underfunded, and yet we appear to be wasting millions, if not hundreds of millions potentially, in the way in which we are procuring IT systems, particularly IT. is it not time a bit of energy and the foot was put in the accelerator in some of this stuff?
There's a lot of energy on this particular accelerator. The audit and assessment process, the Digital First Standards review process, will identify where people are taking decisions that are not to use the common processes and the common components that are available. I think there is a very good argument to consider going forward that we need to find a different mechanism of doing that and finding some form of central spend controls. But that's a matter for ministers and the way in which we run the organisation. And there's something that will be considered as we look forward going forward into the next spending round. Because as I said, we are collecting all that information now, looking forward to so we can make those judgments and make those recommendations.
Thank you. I think Penelope Cooper would like to add something. Can I ask you to
just
be brief?
give Mr Neil some comfort to take your point fully. The pension systems are quite detailed and bespoke. And I am cooperating as a group within a group of public sector pension providers on procurement, because there are many changes in the pension legislation, as you'll be aware, and they affect the whole of the industry. So working with other public agencies who deliver pensions to do some common procurement, because I take your point fully, we're all looking for the same thing, so let's work together. So on the pension side, that's exactly what we are doing. So I hope that gives you some comfort.
Good news.
Okay. I'd like to conclude this evidence session now. I have to say I don't think it's been the most satisfactory session, and I understand that that is due to personnel changes, but that doesn't make our job any easier. So the committee will be considering very carefully its next steps on this report. But can I thank you for your attendance and evidence this morning, and I now suspend the committee until 10:05. Item 3 is the Section 22 report, the 2018-19 audit of the Scottish Prison Service. Can I welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning? Caroline Gardner, Auditor General for Scotland, Gary Devlin, Partner at Scotland Creef, and Mark Roberts, Audit Director, Performance Audit and Best Value from Audit Scotland. Auditor General, I understand you'd like to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. Briefly, today's report focuses on the multiple pressures facing the Scottish Prison Service, which together threaten its financial sustainability and the safe and effective operation of the service. These are clearly outlined in the Auditor's 2018-19 annual report for the Scottish Prison Service. SPS's revenue budget has been decreasing in real terms in recent years. Its 2019-20 budget, the current year, is under pressure from a significant rise in prisoner numbers over the past year, as well as increasing costs. Prisoner numbers exceed the operating capacity of Scotland's prisons, and delays in upgrading the prison estate are increasing its risk of failure. On the 13th of September this year, there were 8,231 people in Scotland's prisons, 555 above operating capacity. This is most evident in Scotland's largest prison, Barlinnie, which is operating at 50% over capacity, despite being considered no longer fit for purpose. Any decision made now to replace important components of the prison estate will take a long time before they have an effect. There are things the SPS can improve in the way it delivers its services. I think it needs to improve its financial planning to deliver its aims and objectives, and it also needs to reduce the high and increasing levels of sickness absence among prison officers, much of which is being driven by high levels of stress-related absence. But the fundamental pressure on the service of rising prison numbers is largely out with its control and requires solutions from across the justice system. Despite the aims of the Scottish Government's justice strategy, Scotland still has one of the highest rates of incarceration in Europe. As illustrated in Exhibit 5 of my report, there are a range of issues that are leading to more people entering the prison system and staying in the system for longer periods of time. Without meaningful change in the way that the justice system as a whole is operating, there is a real risk that prisoner numbers will remain high or even continue to rise and exceed SPS's maximum capacity in the near future. In its programme for government, the Scottish Government has committed to considering the whole system changes needed to address Scotland's internationally high rates of imprisonment. The speed with which this needs to be taken forward is very clear. Alongside me are Gary Devlin as the annual auditor and Mark Roberts from the Audit Scotland Justice team, and between us we'll do our best to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Auditor General. It is a very concerning report, so I'm going to ask Liam Kerr to open questioning for the committee.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Auditor General, you started there by talking about decreasing budget, rising prisoner numbers, the delays in upgrading the estate, the rising violence, the rising staff sickness absence. Now, none of these happen overnight, it seems to me. So these have presumably been developing over several years. So what analysis has been done in previous years by the SPS and or the Scottish Government, and what actually has been done to address this in previous years?
I'll ask Mark Roberts to come in a moment to address that, but it might be helpful, first of all, just to direct the committee's attention to Exhibit 4, which helps to set some of that in context. What we tried to do in Exhibit 4 is to show you prisoner trends over the last few years and projections. And you can see there that actually the upturn we've seen over the last year is a reverse of a trend of reducing prisoner numbers before that. Exhibit 5 later in the report sets out some of the reasons for that, and they're both increasing numbers of prisoners entering the prison system and fewer people leaving. But actually this is not as long-term an issue in the urgent way that I've described it today as you might otherwise think. Mark, I think, can give you a bit more background to that.
Thank you. So, I mean, these pressures, as you say, have been building for a number of years and have been identified in both SPS's annual reporting and in the annual audit reports in previous years that Gary has prepared. I think what happened during 2018-19 was an awful lot of these things all started lining up together. So the factors around staff well-being, around the condition of the estate, around changes in the wider policy around the justice system all started lining up together to drive the number of prisoners in the prison estate upwards. It wasn't that it hadn't been happening, it was that everything started coalescing together to push the numbers of prisoners upwards.
I understand the point made, but just to take an example, and I don't want to take any colleagues' questions for later, very briefly, something like Barlinnie or HMP Inverness do not become, they will always be Victorian. So that is not a new problem. So decent planning would have addressed that years ago, wouldn't it?
And they have been on the Scottish Prison Service's plans in order to redevelop, in particular, both the two prisons that you mentioned for a number of years. The pressures on their capital budgets and so forth have meant that has taken longer than the SPS would have wished. They are very, very keen to progress developing the estate and modernising the estate, but that has not been possible as quickly as they would have liked.
Now, your report, Auditor General, talks about the Scottish Government agreeing to provide additional funding to the SPS during 2019-20, and an element of that is to purchase additional capacity in the two private prisons. So how much is that funding, and what is it going to be spent on, apart from the private prisons?
I'll ask Gary, as the auditor, to come in with the detail. It's important to say that our understanding is that the government has agreed to provide that funding. It hasn't yet been confirmed in SPS's budget, and we're assuming that will happen through the autumn budget revision process that's due at the back end of this year. Gary.
So my understanding of the additional funding is that that would be in the region of £6 million to fund the additional places.
There we go. 6 million to fund the additional places in the private prisons, but you don't know, whatever the amount is, what is it going to be spent on? If the Scottish Government said, we are going to give you some extra money, SPS, aside from the private sector places, what is that going to be spent on?
So there are a range of pressures that are detailed in the report that the Scottish Prison Service has to address. Some of those are capital pressures in relation to investment in the estate. Some of those are revenue type pressures. So the increasing prisoner numbers means that you have to house those prisoners, potentially buy more prison places from the PFI prisons, where the additional capacity in the short run might be obtained from. And simply by having more prisoners, you have more costs in relation to catering and more costs in relation to reform, for example, education costs. So simply the costs increase with prisoner numbers increasing. The gap that's in the report was in the region of about 20 million. The Scottish Prison Service identified savings of about 6.4 million, leaving a 13.5 million gap.
We've mentioned a couple of times the two private prisons. I'm curious about something. My understanding, I see in your report, Auditor General, it costs around £35,000 a year to house a prisoner in the state sector. My understanding is that's about 25,000 in the two private prisons. So, and they've got spaces. So what's different? Why have two private sector prisons got spaces, and apparently it costs £10,000 a year less to house a prisoner there, as against the SPS prisons, where it's costing more and there's no space? What's going on?
Again, I'll ask Gary to give you the detail behind this. We've spent a lot of time probing the difference between prison places and prisoner places, and they are slightly different things that can't be compared directly. So I'll ask Gary to talk you through what we do know about that and what may be questions for the prison service itself.
So there's a lot of a complex answer to that. Firstly, the prison service don't calculate a separate cost per prisoner place for PFI prisons. They calculate an overarching cost per prisoner place. In order to calculate that separate cost, that would be quite a detailed exercise for them to do, and they haven't done that. So the numbers you're quoting, I'm not really sure that I recognised those numbers initially, but perhaps the prison service can provide you with some more detail on that. So when the prison service are budgeting, they are estimating the total number of prisoners that they will have to house. They try to take up the public sector prison places first, because those places are already paid for in a sense, they're there. If they have to take up additional places through the PFI prisons, those have quite significant additional costs. So in the region of about 1.2 million for around 200 places is the additional cost of the prison service from having to take on the additional prisoners, and that's not budgeted for.
Your report, Auditor General, indicates that the SPS doesn't have a medium-term financial strategy, which seems rather odd to me. Why doesn't it have a financial strategy?
I think that's probably a question you'd have to ask them. As the committee knows, I've been recommending for a number of years now that all public bodies need to have medium-term financial strategies, given the pressure on the public finances, what we're often seeing in terms of increasing demand and the increasing volatility that will be in the public finances in future. It is preparing a strategy to align with its revised corporate plan, so there's a timing issue there around it, but given the pressures that it's facing, I think it's critical that it does have a really clear understanding of what its cost pressures are likely to be, and therefore what funding it needs to be able to meet them. Mark, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
No. Just in terms of the corporate strategy that the Auditor General mentioned, that was revised to kind of early by the Scottish Prison Service during the course of last year, in recognition of the fact it was finding itself in this very challenging position of the rise in prisoner numbers. And as the Auditor General says, to support the delivery of that, a medium-term financial strategy would be very valuable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Colin Beattie.
Convener, I'd like to look at this question of the payments being made to prison officers. I was surprised that there is no overtime mechanism with prison officers, and this ex gratia non-contractual payments made on a voluntary basis to officers working increased hours. I mean, that's open to all sorts of problems and issues if it's not properly managed, and you seem to be indicating here, and you've only based this on a sampling of 10. I don't know whether that's statistically significant in terms of the whole volume of these transactions going through. You seem to be indicating there's a problem with about half of them. But why is there an appropriate approval process but no appropriate control mechanism?
The agreement that prison officers aren't eligible for overtime payments was reached between the prison service and the prison officer unions some time ago. And I think it starts from a good place, the assumption that the prisons should be staffed for the number of people who are housed in them and shouldn't rely, as a matter of course, on overtime in order to be able to run safely. But clearly, given the pressures that we're seeing here, that is leading to significant ex gratia payments. I'll ask Gary if he can talk you through what he's seen there and the question of the controls around them.
Yes, so your question is a good one. The sample size, even though it sounds small, is a statistically representative sample. So it does go through what we call a sample size calculator that gives a statistically reliable outcome. But that said, one of the things we found when we went and tested was that all of those ex gratia claims had been appropriately signed, but we couldn't trace that back to the source evidence that confirmed the additional hours worked in 50% of the cases. My understanding is that since that time, one of the recommendations made in our report is that the prison service needed to tighten that up and also needed to do an additional exercise to go off and do more work to investigate that outcome. And my understanding is that they have done that in the interim period, but perhaps they will answer for that if you meet with them.
You say 10 transactions is statistically significant. How many transactions are there of this nature?
I don't know. I could come back to you and tell you exactly what the population is. The population spans 3 years, so payments made in 16, 17, 17, 18 and 18, 19. So each year there'll be a different population number.
I'd be interested in seeing what the actual volume is. What sort of control mechanisms would you anticipate would be satisfactory in terms of managing this? Because you're saying here that there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the notional overtime worked and the size of these payments.
So sorry, we are saying there is a correlation between the overtime worked and the size of the payments. It's quite clear that the ex gratia payments go up. Actually, they go up in correlation to sickness absence.
But you say you can't reconcile them.
Sorry, yes. So what I would expect to have reconciled to would have been some form of time record that demonstrated the prison officer who was making the ex gratia payment claim had actually worked the additional hours. That was the expectation for that primary record.
So
to
there
be
is no
available to the auditor.
real linkage between the hours worked and the payment that's being made. There's no evidence of that.
So the linkage is that for the hours claimed that were approved, the payment made is a valid payment within the terms of the ex gratia payment. So that's true, but for 50% of the cases we couldn't find evidence that the hours had actually been worked.
Now, most of this seems to relate to compensation for sick leave. Would that be correct?
So no, this is the impact of sick leave, reducing the number of prison officers able to safely staff prisons and requiring the prison service to have its prison officers work longer hours to compensate for staff sickness absence.
Now, the value of these ex gratia payments has increased by 65%. Does that directly correlate to the increases in the SPS's sickness rates?
Pretty much it does, actually. So if you look at the increase in sickness absence records that are detailed within the report, it goes up by about 65%. If you were to map that into an expectation of the additional hours for overtime worked, it's pretty much it is quite a good correlation for that. Sorry, but these things also happen in a lumpy way. They don't happen in an entirely linear way. In terms of the additional resource.
There's not directly 65% increase in the number of days lost according to Exhibit 2 in the report. Is it
65% increase in the sickness absence rate, and if you transfer that into number of days lost, and then translate that into the additional time in terms of overtime.
But we're talking that 2018-19, the value of the ex gratia payments increased by 65%, which I'd expect to have a correlation to the number of days lost in terms of sick leave. But if I look at Exhibit 2, 2018-19, yes, it shows a significant increase. I don't think it's 65%, though.
Yes, you wouldn't expect it to be exactly 65%. I mean, maybe I could come back with you and demonstrate
see how that links in, because that looks like a
connection.
lot less than 65% increase in the number of days lost. I'd be interested to see how that fits in. Just to move on to the prisoner numbers. I'm confused by some of the terminology here. We're talking about different capacities. We're talking about operating capacity, design capacity, and maximum capacity. What does it mean?
So in terms of operating capacity, that's the level at which the SPS thinks that it can operate safely with its current workforce. The design capacity is of the current estate in terms of the actual sort of structures of the prisons and the facilities available, recognising that there are different types of prisons, different elements within the prisons that reflect the different varying needs of prisoners. The maximum capacity is what they can absolutely go up to in terms of housing the population, and that would be requiring significant changes to operations, for example, greater sharing of cells and reduced opportunities for prisoners to be outside of cells during the course of the day.
The maximum capacity then isn't actually a capacity that they can actually achieve at this moment with the present prison officers' numbers.
They could do that, but that would place significant pressures on the service in terms of its safe and effective operation.
Do we have any sort of feel as to why so many prison officers are going off, presumably because of stress?
I'll ask the team to come in a moment. I think what we're seeing is a system which is under pressure, with that leading to increased pressure on prison officers, the financial pressures making it more difficult, for example, to do some of the things like education and time out of cells, other leisure that would release pressure within prisons, and that sense of pressures building up in a way that is difficult to release given the current operating circumstances. That's one of the reasons we're concerned about it. Mark, I think you're looking to comment.
I think that captures it very well. I think it is very much a function of the kind of ever-increasing pressures that the service has been facing over recent years that have come to a head during 2018-19.
I mean, looking at Exhibit 4, the number of prisoners has actually been dropping for a number of years. And then 2018-19, we had a significant uptick, and you've given various reasons as to why that's the case. Is this a one-off uptick, and will we then resume a decrease? Is there any projections on that?
I think that's a very challenging question to answer. Certainly, as you say, the long-term trend for the past decade has been a reduction in prisoner numbers, which was obviously in line with what the Scottish Government was trying to achieve. The reversal, I think, came as a little bit of a surprise to many people, as I said in my answer to Mr. Kerr, with the sort of coming together of a range of different pressures, all of them lining up. And some of the conversations that we've had both with SPS and with Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons in Scotland have been around, does this represent the new normal, or something of, as you say, a kind of an anomaly, and things will revert back to the previous trend? And I think the answer is no one's entirely sure at the moment. Certainly the nature of the prison population is changing, both in terms it is ageing. We are seeing, as we detail in Exhibit 5 in the report, longer sentences happening. We are seeing more convictions associated with historical sexual offences, which has a different nature in terms of the type of prisoner that there are. There are more convictions for serious organised crime and so forth. And also convictions for domestic abuse are also increasing. So as well as the quantitative number of prisons increasing, the nature of the prison population is also changing. So whether that becomes what might be described as the new normal, I think remains to be seen.
The bottom half of Exhibit 4 sets out the Scottish Prison Service's scenarios for what might happen, with a best case scenario that sees it coming back down slightly, and a worst case scenario that sees it continuing to increase over the next few years beyond their capacity to accommodate the prisoners that would be involved in that scenario.
Okay.
Na Sarwar.
Origin, I wanted to focus my questions on Barlinnie. Obviously, the most startling statistic is the 50% over capacity. Can you, before I go into a bit more detail, just generally say what dangers you feel there are in Barlinnie in terms of day-to-day operational dangers?
I think that's very hard for us to comment on. It's not our expertise. Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons, I think, is in a better position to comment in that detail. What we have highlighted in this report, though, is that sort of pressure on the prison system makes it harder for prisons to do the sort of re-education, retraining interventions to reduce reoffending that are both part of the solution to the pressure on prisons, but obviously also very important for society as a whole. So that's the first thing. The second, as we say in the report, is it is a Victorian prison. It's difficult to maintain safely, and given the number of prisoners that it accommodates, if there were to be a failure in part of the infrastructure of the prison, that would have very serious consequences for the system as a whole.
Just briefly to add to that, my understanding is that Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons conducted an inspection of Barlinnie last month, so no doubt that report will make its way into the public domain in due course.
Focusing on the risk to staff for a second. Excuse me. We have almost 1 in 5 staff off sick at any one time at Barlinnie. You've said that related to stress. A lot of that stress may well be due to the fact that it's over capacity. We've also had an incident earlier this year where 4 prison guards were seriously assaulted in the exercise yard, and 4 individuals were left to monitor 93 inmates in the exercise yard. Do we have any recorded figures of the number of attacks, assaults on prison staff across the board, or particularly in Barlinnie?
Exhibit 6 sets out the Scottish Prison Service's key performance indicators, and 2 of those focus on assaults on staff by prisoners. They categorise them as serious and minor, and both of those have shown an increase over 2 years, as you can see in the exhibit. We don't have figures for Barlinnie specifically.
Okay. Are we able to find figures for Barlinnie specifically? Because looking at the capacity figures, you would assume that there may well be a higher incidence rate at Barlinnie. Obviously, the numbers will tell us that. Are we able to find the statistics for that?
I think the prison service would have those figures. We've focused on the prison system as a whole here.
And one of the frustrations that was expressed at the time of the assault on the 4 prison guards earlier this year was that there was a feeling, particularly amongst staff, and this was reported by the union, that often any attacks and assaults were not reported. They weren't recorded and weren't reported. For example, the assault on the 4 officers wasn't reported to the police until 3 days after the actual assault took place on the 4 prison officers. Anything around that, around the staff, the level of attacks, how it's recorded and reported, is that being audited properly?
That's very much something that I think would be part of the remit of Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons. As Mark said, there has been a very recent inspection of Barlinnie, and that focus on the professional running of prisons, the regime within them, and the impact on both prisoners and staff is very much part of her responsibility.
Right. And then so that covers the staff side. Then in terms of the risk to inmates, we've had lots of sad reports, particularly in recent months, around attacks in prisons, around individual inmates' safety in prisons, particularly around mental health, suicide attempts, etc. Have any numbers come through the audit that look around the level of danger to inmates in terms of any adverse incidents or bad incidents relating to inmates, and the possible connection to the overcapacity at the Barlinnie?
I've got no doubt that the pressure on prisons and the prison system that we're setting out in this report are bad for everybody involved. They're bad for prison staff, bad for prisoners, and in the bigger picture, bad for Scotland as a whole. The KPIs in Exhibit 6 that I referred to a moment ago captures prisoner-on-prisoner assaults, but again categorised by minor and more serious. It doesn't capture some of the wider dimensions that you're talking about. The Inspector of Prisons has raised concerns about the quality of healthcare in prisons, and particularly the levels of mental health problems that we're seeing. I'm not sure it's something we can comment on directly, other than to recognise that the pressures on the system are exacerbating problems that exist. Mark, you may want to add to that.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say.
And in terms of the prison being marked not fit for purpose and requiring a new build and a new capital investment, clearly there's no clear path for when that capital investment will be available and when that new prison will be built. Is that impacting on maintenance at the building? So because it's been earmarked for a new build, is the maintenance work not happening at the Barlinnie, and is there a backlog in terms of maintenance?
There is a backlog in terms of maintenance. Part of the 6.4 million of savings that the Prison Service have identified, 50% of that comes from a reduction in planned maintenance. 50% of the saving comes from that reduction in planned maintenance. That's across the prison estate. And one of the issues that the Auditor General raises in this report is the pressure that puts in the whole prison estate, but with much more focused pressure on the older Victorian prisons. They suffer from, the natural issues you would imagine of an older prison.
So would it be correct to say that there is probably capital investment in terms of maintenance that's not being spent on Barlinnie because it's earmarked for a closure and a new build?
So just to be clear, and it's your question is again the right one, but repairs and maintenance are revenue expenditure, so they come out of the revenue budget. Capital expenditure tends to be for new prisons or major works,
or major
re-roofing a prison or something like that. Yeah. So it's just how they sit in terms of where they come out of the budget.
Has any value been placed on the level of maintenance if, for example, it was decided we're not going to get a new Barlinnie prison, so we have to be here for the next 10, 20 years, this is what it's going to cost to maintain it where it is at its current site? Is any cost in that?
The Prison Service has a detailed planned maintenance schedule for the entire prison estate that sets out their expectations of the maintenance level and the cost of that would be required. Given current budget pressures, they're not able to maintain the prison estate to the level that they they would.
And what's the gap in terms of money?
I don't know if that off the top of my head, but that is available. So it's part of the 6.4 million of savings that have been put forward by the prison service. So it's going to be around the 3 million mark.
And when do you think we'll be in a position to have a new Berlin prison?
I think that's very much a question for government in terms of when funding can be identified. There is a commitment to replacing both HMP Glasgow and HMP Highland. Funding isn't available, and as I said in my opening remarks, once funding's available, it's still quite a long lead time until they're built and up and running.
And any idea of the level of funding that's required?
I'm not sure that's a question we can answer.
Thank you.
Okay. Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener Caroline. I wonder if I could just ask a general question about the budget situation. I think your report shows that the allocation is pretty much flatlined. Yeah. But I think there's an additional capital allocation on the way of £30 million, I think. But your paragraph 9 there tells us that there's an underspend in the SPS last year of 6.57 million. And it mentions that that's a trend over the past 10 years, underspend trend over the past decade. Do we have any figure about what the total underspend is over the 10 years and why that's happening?
You're right, first of all, that the budget has been flat cash over the last few years, which obviously relates to a real terms reduction. The underspend that we quote in paragraph 6.37 is mainly due to slippage in the capital programme. And I think the same is true for the underspend in previous years, but Gary will keep me straight there.
Yes, that's true. So the biggest single element of that is HMP Glasgow replacement. So the prison service would be factoring in their budget an element of capital to start works on a replacement prison for HMP Glasgow. A number of other things in there, Fresh Start and so on. And obviously that project hasn't progressed, and therefore you get the underspend at the end of the year.
We've also seen slippage on replacing the estate for the women's prison for Sockton, moving to the community units that are planned instead, and there's been slippage there, which is obviously not welcome given the policy priority about replacing Sockton.
Do we know the total underspend over the 10 years now? We don't know that.
I don't think we do have that. We could. I mean, it is something we can get to. It's a matter of record for each year.
It's interesting that if there's a significant underspend for 10 years, but there's an additional capital allocation, it doesn't seem it's the same thing.
It's because of the way the Scottish Government's budget works. It works on an annual cycle. So every year it almost starts afresh rather than carrying forward underspends from previous years and then reallocating them to the same capital project.
Okay. Could I ask you a question that's really in Exhibit 6, Caroline? It's those performance indicators. There's an interesting one in the middle of that, if you don't mind me asking about. It's talking about purposeful activity hours. It seems to be a significant drop in that year on year. I can't see any commentary around it. Could you possibly explain what's going on there and what the likely or the possible impact that might be having on the prison population?
Happy to, and I'll ask Mark to pick that up.
It is a significant decrease, and again, I think it reflects that the financial pressures that the service is under, that there is less capacity and less time amongst prison officers to support prisoners in purposeful activities, and that then has knock-on effects in terms of the ability of prisoners to complete programmes that might assist them in leaving prison. It might reduce the positive effects that may accrue from those purposeful activities when prisoners leave the prisons and come back into the community. So it has both a knock-on effects in terms of potentially prisoner numbers, in terms of a slower rate of release, and also it potentially has impacts for the individuals involved, and also kind of potentially for reoffending.
I know it's probably unfair to ask you, but the inspector presumably would have some view on the impact of that on prison behaviour, for example, that some of the members have been raising earlier. Presumably there's a correlation, perhaps, between the two.
I think very much that the inspectorate would be better placed to comment on that, yeah.
Okay. Lastly, I think in your opening remarks, Caroline, you said this requires solutions across the justice system to participate in helping to improve the situation we find ourselves in. Can you say anything at all about the remand situation in Scotland? My understanding is that it's double the level that it is in England and Wales, and why that might be, and are there any solutions being deployed, to try to manage that a bit better in Scotland?
First of all, you're absolutely right that addressing the prison services problems requires a response across the justice system, and at the highest level our incarceration rate is the highest in Europe. We have to ask why that is and whether there are better ways both of dealing with offending but also reducing reoffending and reintegrating people into society. On remand specifically, if we look at Exhibit 5 again, which is the exhibit showing the factors affecting numbers going into prison, we talk specifically at the bottom half of the page about supervised bail as an alternative to remand. At its height in 2005-06, there were 917 people or cases of people who were on supervised bail rather than on remand. In 2017-18, that had dropped to 268. I don't know if we can say much about the reasons for that, but clearly there is that increase in pressure on the prisons because we're not using the alternatives that we have used in the past to the extent we were using as much. I think Mark can probably give you a bit more colour of that.
I think that's right, and just in terms of what has been the response, as Caroline said, this requires to be a kind of whole justice system response in terms of trying to reduce this, and what the government has done is to establish and it chairs a prison resilience leadership group which takes representation from across the justice sector and is meeting very, very regularly in terms of trying to look at all the multiple factors that are pushing the prison population up, and that to us I think seems the right approach to taking a whole system approach in terms of trying to respond to this increase in numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Like Mr Coffey, I'm looking at Exhibit 6 on the key performance indicators, and I want to ask about reduced substance abuse. So the performance indicator has also deteriorated. So I read from that fewer prisoners who are abusing substances in prison the prison service is having less success in managing to reduce the substance abuse. And I appreciate that it's fallen, but it's only by 2%. But I'm interested in the figures. I don't know, Gary Devlin, if you can tell me what percentage of the prison population you think are using drugs in prisons.
Sorry, I can't. That's not data that we obtained as part of the audit.
Okay.
But I'm sure the prison service would know that.
So how do you come to the 45% in terms of the KPI? Is that from the Scottish Prison Service?
It's the Scottish Prison Service's own data that informs their performance management system.
Okay. Obviously, my interest in this is the drugs problem is huge in Scotland at the moment, and certainly the Dundee Drugs Commission reported recently on the interaction between people coming out of prison and then in the community and how that works. So it's maybe something we can get into further. Can I now refer you to Exhibit 5? Yes, Liam Kerr.
Can I take a point on that?
Yes, sure.
Just, I was interested in that exact figure because, and you'll forgive me, I'm pulling stats from the back of my head, but I have a feeling that the prisoners that are released from prison in 2007, something like 14% of them tested positive for drugs.
14.
And 14. Last year, I think that was about 27%. And if I'm right, or if I'm even in the right territory, I didn't see how that married with that figure of reduced substance abuse. I just wonder if you'd care to comment on that.
I think genuinely that would be a question better targeted at the Scottish Prison Service in terms of how they collect that data and then how they report that data. In terms of the audit process, we didn't look at that, so it wouldn't be fair to comment.
Fair.
It would be reasonable to say this is a major issue for the prison service.
Yes.
Managing drugs is a really significant challenge for them, spice and so on. So part of the reason why they're gathering this data is so they can have better insight into that challenge.
Yeah, and I would put on the record too, not an easy one for staff to deal with either. Exhibit 5, Auditor General, you point to some of the pressures on the prison service, and it's a very useful illustration. But at the top, I'm looking specifically about the growth in convictions for legacy sex offences and convictions for domestic abuse. Now, the convictions for domestic abuse, this has been discussed in Parliament for quite a few years now. I remember Kenny McCaskill introducing the legislation, I think maybe back as far back as 2012. So my point in this is there should have been reasonable anticipation in the prison service that due to these moves in Parliament or legislative moves that the prison population might increase. Does your report really say that they've not planned for that?
I think I'm not in a position to go that far. I think, as Mark said earlier, there has been planning going on. The prison service does have, and has had for some time, forecasts about what's likely to happen with the number of prisoners over a long period, and that's a positive step and one that I welcome. If you look at Exhibit 5, though, it shows a number of factors all happening at the same time, some of which are increasing the number of people going in, including longer sentences, for example, which is difficult to predict, and some changes to the policy around prisoner release, yes, the way in which alternatives to remand or home detention curfew are being used that are stopping the number of people coming out, all at the same time when the budget has been flat and therefore reducing in real terms. So while I suspect there's always room to improve planning, my starting point isn't that the prison service hasn't been planning well enough or isn't a well-run organisation.
That you don't believe that?
No, that's not my starting point in
Yes.
this report. I have no evidence that they haven't planned appropriately for the focus on domestic violence, which you're rightly highlighting.
Mm-hmm. It's just that these pressures are all coming at the same time.
That's
And
right.
especially I'm quite struck by ending automatic early release. That's only had a small impact to date, you say, but may look to another 370 prisoners over the next decade. So they're trying to deal with all this at once.
That's right.
Okay. Alex Neil.
I first of all declare an interest in that. I've got Shotts Prison in my constituency. Can I focus in on Exhibit 5? And I mean, you could pick any one of these, but I'm interested in the ones in this bottom second half of the page about the impact each of these issues is having. And if I can take, for example, the financial pressure, staff absences and prisoner numbers adversely affecting the number of prisoners completing reoffending rehabilitation programmes. I mean, I'm dealing with quite a number, because they're technically my constituents at the moment, of people, for example, in Shotts, who are very concerned about the lack of resources in the self-change programme, which is a key part of getting people to the point where they can get parole. And I would say the self-change programme is actually in crisis at the moment. And it's a very good example of where, by not addressing that, we're actually going to end up with many more people staying in prison much, much longer, and then a higher percentage probably reoffending, who then eventually get out because they haven't had the rehabilitation programmes. And it seems to me that investing heavily, for example, in this would actually, in the medium term, quite quickly, over a 3, 4, 5 year period, not only save money and reduce prison numbers, but it would actually reduce reoffending as well. I mean, I hear what you say about there's a task force about and across board tackling resilience, but is it moving fast enough? Is it action orientated? Because it seems to me this is something that needs immediate action, you know, not taking minutes and wasting years in a task force.
The purpose of my report is to bring to this committee exactly those sorts of pressures and the risk that they become self-perpetuating, that the inability to invest in reducing reoffending means we have more people being released, committing offences and coming back in, so the numbers continue to climb. Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons in her annual report last month was very clear about that, the risk of that sort of perfect storm of factors coming together, making it more difficult for the prison system to work effectively and for the justice system as a whole too. As we've said a couple of times, though, I think there's questions about the government's response to that. The Justice Strategic Board's work is a question for government rather than something we can give you assurance on at this stage.
Is there any, for example, the reduction in funding, because cuts were announced quite recently to the funding for this specific aspect. I mean, have you had a chance to look at the impact of those cuts on prisoner numbers?
Not directly. As you know, we've reported in the past on the justice system and work to reduce reoffending. We reported last year on the slow start of Community Justice Scotland, the new organisation that's intended to develop some of the alternatives to imprisonment. We are considering coming back to it in future, and Mark's doing some work to scope that now. Mark, do you want to say some more about that?
No, not really, but very much, because we're recognising this as a whole system problem. The Auditor General has asked us to prepare some approaches that we could do in terms of looking at a major performance audit, in terms of looking at the justice system as a whole.
Right, I think that's a good idea, because actually if you also look at the other two, I mean, just changes to the criteria for the home detention curfew and the impact of that, and the impact of the reduction in supervised bail, if we get back to the higher numbers, that's well over 800 people who would not be in prison who are currently in prison. 800 is 10% of the entire prison population. So it seems to me these are fairly urgent issues that need to be addressed. I think you agree with that.
Absolutely.
Can I ask you, it seems to me there are two broad issues here financially. One is the prison service is claiming, I think with justification, that it's underfunded and needs significantly more money, much more than £6 million. But also, is the prison service making the best use of the money it has? Is the prison service making best use of the money it has? Is there genuine underfunding? And what do you think the additional funding, level of additional funding is required to even stabilise the situation, let alone get prisoner numbers down in the medium to long term?
I think we can probably have a go at answering two of those questions and not the third. I think there are things that the Scottish Prison Service can do to improve the way that it uses its finances. I said that in my opening remarks. And at the very least, the longer-term financial planning will be important in that, the financial plan to accompany its new corporate plan. So we need to see that. Having said that, the budget of the prison service has been flat cash since 2014-15 now, I think, which accounts to a quite significant real terms decrease, 12.5%. That might have been manageable had we seen a continuation of the reduction in prisoner numbers that we were seeing until 2018-19, but we haven't. We've seen that reversing, and we're seeing, as Mark touched on earlier, older prisoners needing to be accommodated with different needs, particularly as a result of historic sexual abuse convictions and longer sentences. We're seeing prisoners with dementia who are having to be cared for the first time with those sorts of health problems. We're seeing increasing levels of drug use. The pressures in the system are increasing. So I think there needs to be a close look at what the resources are likely to be. And I think, at least in the short term, there may need to be an increase. Equally important is the capital investment to make sure the estate is fit for the future. But the big answer has to be to step back and to look at the justice system as a whole and the way that it's working, given our high incarceration rates. I should also obviously recognise that the Scottish Government's budget as a whole is under pressure. There isn't an immediate source for this money to come from, with pressure on other things. So making best use of money right across government, right across the justice system, has to be the starting point for that.
My final question is, within the prison system as a whole, I mean, for example, Serco claim to have better outcomes in terms of preparing prisoners for leaving the system, and for the destination of their prisoners suggests a lower reoffending rate. So my question is, both in terms of comparing the private prisons vis-à-vis the public prisons, but also comparing different jails, different prisons. Is there any evidence to support any particular model, either within the public sector or between the public and the private sector, in terms of getting better outcomes? Is performance better in some prisons than it is in others? And if everybody was brought up to the best performer, what difference would that make?
We reported on reducing reoffending specifically 2 or 3 years ago. Mark led that work, so I'll ask him to talk you through what we knew then.
It was actually slightly longer ago than that, I'm afraid. It was back 2012, 2013 that we last reported on reducing reoffending. Again, that very much focused on the kind of whole system approach that needed to be taken. Obviously, there's been quite significant legislative change since then with the abolition of the community justice authorities and, as the Auditor General mentioned, the establishment of Community Justice Scotland. So that has changed very significantly the sort of the approach that's being taken to community sentencing as opposed to custodial sentencing. In terms of the effectiveness of different approaches between prisons or between the public and the private sector, I don't have any information on that, and that may be something that Her Majesty's Inspector at Prisons in Scotland would have more information on.
Okay, thank you.
Liam Kerr.
Very briefly, if I may. I think that was that gets to the nub of what the issue will be going forward. And so, Mark, when you look at this area next, will you? The SPS has been forced to hopefully temporarily act through care. Is there any way that you will be able to assess the impact of that? Hopefully it will be only temporarily, but let's say it is over a significant period. Is there any way to assess the impact of through care on reoffending / reconviction rate?
I would hope we'll be able to find some way of doing that in terms of how that's doing. At this point in time, I wouldn't want to commit that we could definitely find a method that we could do that. But that would be a really important question that we would try and think about how we would get at. It would be challenging, and it would also potentially also be quite long term, would be my initial slight caveat to that, as terms of how long you would have to wait to see whether or not there was going to be an impact. But that was certainly something that we would factor into our thinking about how to approach a major performance audit.
Great, thanks.
Okay. Do members have any further points for Bill Bowman?
Thank you, Convener. If I can go back then perhaps to some of the numbers. On page 7 in paragraph 16, you speak about payments totalling 13.9 million. But before I ask about that, just to be clear that 13.9 is not the same or doesn't contain the 4.25 ex gratia that Colin Beattie was
additional to that
asking about. So we had over 3 years, we had a 6.5 million, 3.7 million, 3.6 million, 2,000 to each employee in the first year, and then 1,000 each. So does that mean, can you just divide them and you get approximately just over 3,000 employees receiving these payments?
I don't think it quite works exactly like, yes, I mean, yeah, it must be close to that number.
Okay, well, roughly,
yeah,
but
roughly.
Is it the same group of employees each year?
So the employees are the prison officers who were initially in receipt of those payments. So if you were a prison officer, you were eligible to receive that payment for your engagement in the prison officer professionalisation programme.
So it's the same group that got the same.
Yes, that's right. It's the same
each
group.
year.
It may be different people because people leave and so on.
Yeah,
yes.
Taking account of that. Yeah, thanks. And were these ex gratia payments?
So no, these payments were approved by Scottish Government and were made, they're not contractual. So in that sense, they are ex gratia. But they were approved and made by the prison service.
So these be paid tax-free?
Yes. Well, no, it's income that would be subject to tax. Sorry, it is income.
So the 6.5 million or the total would include the burden that presumably the employer had to pay on top of that?
Yes, the employer would have to pay income tax on that.
So
the employee, sorry.
The employer though will have, what, national insurance, pension contributions?
Yes, there will be other costs associated with that.
Do you know what percent that might be on top of that?
The usual percentage for national insurance, 5%, I think.
And the employer's pension?
It's different for prison officers. I don't recall the exact number of contribution rate the prison officers pay.
So it's quite a significant number.
Yes.
So we had those over those 3 years. They say they're non-contractual, but the same amount appears several times. You know, each year it happens. Is there not sort of an element of contractual?
No. So
even so, that people who didn't get it were entitled to get it because there was the following equality
So it's
action.
not contractual because it was specifically for the purpose of securing the engagement of prison officers in developing the prison officer professionalisation programme. As soon as that programme is done and it was voted against, so it did not proceed, and we do raise issues about value for money in relation to that. One of the things that, because of the implementation of that, they found that because it wasn't available to non-prison officer staff, that there was an equal pay claim made. And you can see the number coming out in paragraph 18 in relation to that.
So they were paid this amount to take part in this programme, and then they decided not to take part in this programme?
No, to support the development of the programme.
And
then
they didn't do that?
And then they voted against the programme.
But they got paid 3 years in a row?
Yes.
To support this programme, and they voted against it?
That's right.
Well, why did they keep getting paid it then?
Well, that's a question we raised in the audit around the appropriateness of those payments and the value for money questions in those. And I think that is a question for the Chief Exec and
So what answer did you get from them?
The Chief Exec and others felt that in order to secure the engagement of prison officers in developing that programme, that this was the best way of securing that engagement.
So they tried that once, twice, 3 times, and it didn't work. Have they continued with that in the current year?
No, so those payments have stopped.
They've stopped. Do we know why the Scottish Government approved this, or was it just the prison service itself?
So the payments were approved by Scottish Government.
As we say in paragraph 16.
And you would not consider that to be good value for money?
We say in the report we can't determine that it did represent value for money because there were no success criteria for it. We've reported them here so they're transparent to the committee, along with the equal pay claim that also came out of the approach that was taken.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, can I thank you all very much indeed for your evidence this morning. I now close the public session of this meeting.